Imagine the middle of a pitch-black night in the center of the Atlantic Ocean. Instruments in the cockpit of the Air France Flight 447 started acting wildly. Speed readings dropped to dangerous lows, and the autopilot failed. The state-of-the-art Airbus A330 carrying 228 souls spiraled into chaos in the blink of an eye. What happened in the following moments little resembled anything short of a catastrophe. And so sudden, so terrifying, it earned it the title Titanic of the skies. But what happened? That was the cause of this disaster. Why weren't the pilots able to save this plane? You wouldn't believe the twists in this horrible story. The terrible story of Air France Flight 447 begins on May 31, 2009. It was one of those normal evenings in Brazil, as Air France Flight 447 neared preparing for a takeoff from Rio de Janeiro. The clock was striking nearly 8 o'clock p.m., and the massive Airbus A330 was set to ferry 216 passengers and 12 crew members across the Atlantic Ocean to Paris. The Airbus A330 represented one of the most modern aircraft flying under the Air France flag. It held the latest in aviation technology and for its time was truly the pinnacle of aviation engineering. The jet had accumulated close to 19,000 hours of flight time, and the CF6 engines were soundly checked prior to takeoff, without malfunction or defect. This was a well-maintained aircraft, with all systems apparently working just right. As passengers took their seats, little did they know that this would be a flight that would not reach its destination. The travelers hailed from up to 30 nationalities, the majority being French, Brazilians, and Germans. Some were on business, some on leisure. None knew what was in store for them. In the cockpit, 3 were settling in for the long flight. The scene of the lot was 58-year-old Captain Marc Dubois, an experienced hand with over 11,000 flying hours. His co-pilot, David Robert, was all of 37, with over 6,500 flying hours in his 13-year career, 4,500 plus in the cockpit of the Airbus A330. There was also 32-year-old Pierre-Cédric Bonin, the junior of the team and least experienced, with about 3,000 hours of flight time. This is because Air France procedures entailed the inclusion of a third pilot on long flights. By doing so, each pilot would get rest breaks through the flight, and hence will not fly for long hours during a flight and be very tired at any given time. This would be an incredibly important safety element for a flight that was estimated to last more than 10 hours, a flight bound to cross the notoriously unpredictable Atlantic Ocean. At about 8:30 p.m., Flight 447 lifted off from Rio de Janeiro and went smoothly up into the night. Everything was done by the book, and the jet reached 20,000 feet without a glitch. The aircraft then leveled off with the autopilot system being turned on to relieve a little load off the pilots as technology advanced enough to take over the flight. The third pilot, Bonin, had gone to have his proper rest then while the plane was flying properly over the Brazilian coastline. By this time, 1:30 am, the aircraft had attained its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet and was flying northeast of the South American continent over the Atlantic Ocean. The region was infamous for hosting the most hostile weather, including frequent thunderstorms with towering clouds and heavy rain. Of course, they could be considered normal weather in the region, but surely must have been a great challenge even for the most seasoned pilot. The weather began to deteriorate as Flight 447 pressed on. The track ahead was filled with thunderstorms and heavy cloud formations, and the aircraft's weather radar could hardly accurately determine the severity of these formations. Advanced as it was, the technology had its failings, especially when it came to the capricious, rapidly shifting weather of the equatorial Atlantic. But in the cockpit, the options were being weighed. One decision was to attempt to fly on top of the worst of the weather by increasing the altitude of the aircraft from 35,000 to 37,000 feet. However, during the exit climb, they encountered unexpected difficulties. The outside air was very warm, which thinned out the air and made it far more difficult to get the plane to its intended altitude. Still, at around 2 o'clock am, Bonin came back to the cockpit, and Captain Dubois retired to his scheduled rest. However, crucial information about challenging weather was not passed on to Bonin, who remained with growing complexity to handle along with Robert. The pilots still flying the aircraft estimated turbulence in the next few minutes. The cabin crew was informed, and the pilots braced themselves for the expected rough flight. As if it were meant to be, the aircraft flew right into moderate turbulence, which was quite normal in these regions. It was just then that the aircraft was leaving the turbulence when it began malfunctioning. In the process, ice crystals had initiated building up inside the plane's pitot tubes, small yet important instruments designed to be responsible for the aircraft air velocity measurement. The tubes are important in supplying accurate speed readings to pilots, with any blockage likely to lead to serious trouble. Because of these gathering crystals, the speed readings grew rather inaccurate. The pitot tubes, though fitted with heating elements, could not withstand the severity of the situation. The icing of the pitot tubes gave a sudden drop in speed readings that sent the pilots into confusion. The sudden speed of the plane had dropped from a safe 275 knots to an alarmingly low 139 knots. All of this was now being reflected in the instruments, representing a sudden and extreme change in readings, a state of alarm in the cockpit. The aircraft began to stall as things really started to get out of control. It reached a state where the wings were not producing enough lift to keep it up in the air. The stall warning wailed in the cockpit, a pretty fast loss in altitude. In a stall, an aircraft might continue flying forward, but starts falling toward the ground at an alarming rate. The fully engaged pilots of Saving the Plane attempted manual control of the aircraft. They managed temporarily to turn the stall warnings off, creating a very short moment of relief. But very short it was, as another problem emerged almost at once. The airspeed indicator showed that the speed fell even more, to the alarmingly low level of 73 knots. That was well below the minimum safe velocity for the altitude they were at, and the plane was right on the edge of disaster. The storm and darkness of the night made visibility outside the plane almost nil. The pilots couldn't rely on their instruments, which showed conflicting and unreliable information. In despair, they switched the landing lights on and off, so that at least they could see anything outside the aircraft. Thick clouds and heavy rain obscured everything. They were blind in the air. Before he could heave even a sigh of relief, another stall warning kicked in, this time leaving no doubt about the severity of their position. The aircraft was in grave danger, so were the lives of all the passengers and other people on board. They called Captain Dubois back into the cockpit, but by that time, so much precious time had already been lost. By the time Dubois arrived, the aircraft had dropped from its cruising altitude of 38,000 feet in over a minute to 30,000 feet. The situation was literally deteriorating by the second, and could be options for recovery. Even having taken full manual control of the aircraft, the pilots did not manage to correct either the angle of the plane or stop further stalling. The altitude continued to drop along with the plane's thrust levels. Continued stall warnings seemed to make no difference in what either pilot was trying to make right. Now the aircraft was going down at a very alarming rate, 10,000 feet per minute. As they kept plummeting, it became scarier by the minute, the feeling of being out of time. They had only 9,000 feet left to recover and pull the aircraft out of its deadly dive. The pilots frantically tried to reset the systems and engage the secondary flight controls, but nothing worked. The sad realization that indeed there was nothing more to be done set in when the aircraft reached an altitude of 4,000 feet. Everything had gotten beyond recovery. Between 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock a.m., Air France Flight 447 hit the Atlantic Ocean after a terrifying descent of just 3 minutes and 30 seconds. The once mighty Airbus at 330 was now submerged in the ocean's depths, taking along with it the lives of 216 passengers and 12 crew members. Nobody survived. 2 days after it went down, wreckage from the plane washed up on the coast of Brazil. Among the debris, search teams began to recover the bodies of some passengers and personal effects which once were part of everyday reality. It wasn't until April of 2011 that, finally, the last of the plane's debris, which included black boxes, have been recovered from the ocean floor. It was those black boxes that held the key to understanding what happened during those final, telling minutes. Data from its black boxes provided critical insights that allowed investigators to piece together the sequence of events leading up to the disaster. The investigation resulted in some important changes being made in the field of aviation safety. Improved designs of the pitot tubes, implicated as critical in the tragedy, became part of new standards to avert similar tragedies. This tragedy remains one of the greatest and most dreaded aviation accidents, and is still referred to as the Titanic of the skies. It serves as a reminder of those vulnerabilities that may be part of even the most modernized technologies, where human souls are in the balance. Thank you for watching. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this sad story. What shocked you the most? Leave a comment below, like if you found this interesting, and subscribe for more compelling stories like this.